Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Grow Food Essay. This one's going to be about composting. We're going to review a couple of different methods on how to do that, like the chop and drop, composting bins, keyhole composting, straight in the ground, worm bins, and even composting poop. So stay tuned. One of the most easiest, simplest ways is whenever you're out in the garden and you're working with a lot of plants, is growing a lot of broadleaf plants so that they can make actual compost. You just chop and drop them and leave them in place so that this can turn into organic matter here. Sometimes it's best to try to get it covered with mulch. That'll help preserve the nitrogen as it leaves the greens and goes into the soil. One other tool I like to use for this is this right here. Can easily remove unwanted material and chop it right in place. Another waste comes from whenever you're cooking. After cooking, we usually have a countertop unit here, and below that we have our actual compost bin. The screw on top. We add our compost from the countertop into our main bin. And then we like to add some sort of carbon material, because this strong nitrogen material is going to get really watery, and we like to add something that can help absorb the moisture as it breaks down in the container before it goes out into the compost bin. This can help reduce that bacteria that often kind of forms and makes a really stinky smell. That usually forms from anaerobic activity, a little too much water or too much liquid in the compost. And so adding carbon material, organic matter, that can help absorb those liquids can really reduce that bacteria from growing. That kind of makes more of a sewage, stinky smell. You can build a separate compost bin area. This one's made out of just pallets screwed together. Whenever you add your compost into these, you want to make sure that you dig open an area for it to be deposited. You can already feel some of the heat from the microbes in there working and breaking down the material. Those are good beneficial microbes. And there's decomposers like worms that are also come in. These are microscopic that we usually don't see. And so after we do that, we want to make sure again that we always cover our compost with leaves or other brown material. I usually keep a bag of leaves by the compost bin. People throw out their leaves all the time on the curb, so that's a good way to grab some and have it covered like that. That'll allow it to decompose and absorb some of that moisture. Another method is introduced in this Gaia's garden book. And this method was actually introduced in Africa, but it's called the keyhole garden. This is a method, so there's sometimes problems with creating compost in an area and then having to go out and take that compost whenever it's ready and move it into another space like in your garden. So this is a way to compost directly into the garden. And so what you would normally do is you would have your compost actually be right here in the center, and it's filled with a little mesh bag, either mesh wire or some kind of material that allows large particles to be held in and small particles to pass through. Then around that you build a garden bed that goes in a circular motion around, pressed right up against that mesh screen. So as compost starts to break down here, it actually will flow into the garden bed. Worms can move back and forth through the space. This can also help retain moisture in the bed, and it just allows the nutrients to naturally excrete into your garden bed that there would normally be a loss if you're composting away from the garden area. One of the most simplest ways is to compost directly into the garden. So right here we have a satsuma tree, which is kind of like a mandarin orange, and over here, safely away from the distance of the root systems, we can actually dig a hole and just put our compost into the soil there. So we put it down, we add the carbon material on top, we cover it with cardboard and something heavy, and here you can see as it breaks down directly into the garden, we can break up some of the clay soils that we have with this adding carbon or nitrogen and carbon materials into the clay soil. That'll help break that down. You can see all of these second stage decomposers here that like to break down the material, but we're also just introducing a lot of microbial activity and fungi to the garden this way. If you are going to be composting directly into the garden bed, make sure you don't compost too close to where you're planting. That compost can actually burn the root system of some of the smaller, delicate plants. So that's why we'd stick to possibly composting around trees. One of the benefits to composting directly in the garden is sometimes you'll end up getting volunteer plants. So there's been times whenever I've planted next to a tree and I'm able to get a lot of squash around at the base that actually helps form some of the guild and support network that goes along with these trees. If you are going to be composting in the garden and you don't have any fruit trees, maybe stick to a pathway or something that's slightly away from some of the plants that you're working with here. You don't want to directly plant right on top of it or next to it, but maybe in the pathway is okay. Here's an asparagus that's growing. This takes about 3 years for the root systems to develop into an asparagus that's of a size that you're able to eat. These almost never make it inside the house. I always end up eating them out here. Another method is worm bins. So this is a really small worm bin unit, but the basic principle is basically you can do variations where you either just have an outdoor unit and you just have worms in that and you just feed them that, or you can make these kind of stacked units that basically will have holes in it. You would have the worms living in this top section with a lot of organic material for it to eat, and then this has holes in it as well, and it drains out their waste into this one, and you can collect some of the larger materials here. This can also drain into a last container that doesn't have any holes in it, that can usually get a lot of the seepage of the water and fluids that kind of come out of that are also really beneficial. Vermicomposting, which is what is composting with worms, can be also used in things like whenever you're making compost teas and things like that. They can be really nutritious material, or they can be applied, the castings can be applied directly into the garden as compost. Worms are actually one of the only kind of animals that as the material passes through their gut, it actually gains more bacteria and other things that can be really beneficial. It's kind of got a stickiness that helps hold some of the soil in. So these are all things that actually increase whenever worms are brought into the system. This last method is dealing with human excrement, human poop. in urine. If you wanted to compost urine, it's best just to apply that directly into the garden. If you wanted to compost more human waste, biosolids, then one of my recommendations is to use a closed system, and that would basically be using a 55-gallon barrel, creating a platform over the top that has a toilet seat on it. You would want to make sure that as this container fills up with waste, and it gets to a large amount of size, that you're also adding, again, things like sawdust and a lot of stuff to kind of help soak up the liquids that are in there, and that'll help reduce a lot of that smell. Whenever this container fills all the way up, you would have another container next to it, and you would cap this one off and let it sit for about a year. So this is almost the same if you were to have a composting unit or a composting bin. You want to make sure you have multiple units so that one can be at a state of rest before you use that compost, and then another one can be active. So you would remove the top of this and you would start depositing into this unit here until this unit is completely decomposed. For human poop, it needs to be a year or longer. For regular compost waste, you can actually start using that in as quickly as several months. It all really depends on if you're hot composting or if you're cold composting. Whenever you're hot composting, you usually have a higher amount of nitrogen material. So nitrogen material is going to be things that are going to be like your greens and the kitchen waste that we put into the compost. The carbon material is going to be things like these leaves and dead grasses and things like that. Whenever the balance is closer to a higher amount of 50% of nitrogen material, green materials, then the temperature can actually really increase, and especially as you stir the compost, you can move those microbes around. What you want to keep in mind is as it does that, it'll decompose a lot quicker that way. One of the most simplest ways, though, is to just let it pile up in layers, and then after that one's full, switch over to another composting unit and start going there. That's cold composting, and that kind of just happens in its own natural state. Whenever we're going to be cold composting, the most simpler one is a balance of 1/3 of greens and then 2/3 of browns. Always having a higher amount of browns can really reduce the chance of the compost smelling or getting too funky. You do want to maintain the moisture in the compost so that the microbes can move around. They move within the water, and they can also be moved around by shoveling. But the ideal is to keep just a little bit of moisture in there, not to where it's soaked, but just where it's damp. That allows the right environment for those microbes to be thriving. So thanks for joining us in another round of Grow Food SA. Make sure to like, share us, and subscribe for more updated information on videos as they come. Thanks.